Free will and non-duality. Again, a challenging topic because non-duality is a challenging topic. But let's do something simple here. Let's say, if we do have free will, wouldn't it stand to reason that we also have the ability to deny that we have free will? If we don't have free will, then the discussion is really meaningless. Because if I think I have free will, well, that's just circumstances beyond my control that have determined that I have this belief. If you believe you don't have free will, it's circumstances beyond your control that made you believe this. So if we are to have any kind of meaningful discussion, we have to at least allow the possibility that we have the ability to make choices. And so the question is, as I've said in one of my videos on the fundamental questions about free will, how free is our will? And that's where the discussion of non-duality versus duality can really help us come to grips with this. Now, I first became aware of this whole discussion about free will when I was 18, 19, and I was in my meditation movement. I had these teachings based on Eastern philosophy and the Vedas. And there are certainly many of the Eastern gurus that will deny that we have free will. They will say everything is predestined by your past karma. But if you think about this logically, where does your past karma come from? Yeah, it comes from past lives, but what created that karma in the first place? If you follow the karmic spiral back, there must be a time where it started. In other words, you had no karma and then you made karma. What caused you to do that? Wasn't it a choice you made? Wasn't there a time in the past where your life wasn't predestined? It wasn't put on a track? So when you think about this, you realize, you come back to the question I've talked about in previous videos. What's the purpose of existence? Why are we even here? Is it just to make karma, balance karma, be free of the karma, or is there some bigger purpose? Here in the West, we have an opposite or a different approach to this. We have the scientific materialists who are using brain research to claim that we don't have free will because there's brain activity before a person makes a conscious choice to push a certain button. And I actually thought for many years that spiritual people who were into the more New Age teachings and had gone beyond the traditional deterministic view of karma, that they would be open to the existence of free will. But I have found to my surprise that quite a few of these teachers who teach non-duality, they deny that we have free will. And why do they deny it? Because they are denying that there's a separate self that's real. And this ties in with what I talked about in my previous videos, where I say that some of these people who believe in non-duality or talk about non-duality, they haven't grasped that differentiation is not the same as duality. So therefore they reason that the selves that we have right now, they are separate selves. And beyond that is the one mind, the undifferentiated mind, and that's the only real mind. So there's only these two kinds of minds. There's the separate self, or there's infinite awareness, or Brahman, or however you describe it. So there's self and no self, or at least a universal self. But as I've explained in my previous videos, this ignores the question of why do we exist? How did we come to exist in the first place? And what is the purpose of our existence? And as I've explained, the purpose of our existence is our growth in consciousness, our transcendence of self. We start out with a certain limited, localized sense of self, and we are here to transcend that sense of self, reach higher and higher levels of self, until we eventually reach the level of the Creator consciousness, the Creator out of which we are an extension. In other words, there is only one mind, but this one mind has chosen to extend itself as individual selves. And so the distinction you have to make here is that there is the ultimate self, call it Brahman, call it Creator, call it infinite awareness. That's the one self, the undivided self. Then there is the individual selves that we were all created with. And then there's the separate selves that people on earth have created. But as I've explained, the separate selves are created out of the duality consciousness. And that's why we have forgotten that we are connected beings, that we are extensions of the one mind. So yes, certainly one of the goals of spiritual growth is to get out of that illusion, this Maya, as the Buddha called it, this consciousness of death, as Jesus called it, and awaken from these separate selves and realize we are connected selves, and then gradually expand our sense of connection until we attain oneness, first with our higher selves, then with the ascended masters above us, and then we can ultimately transcend our sense of self until we reach the Creator consciousness. So this is the purpose. The purpose of our existence is our growth in consciousness, is self-transcendence. The problem is that when you go into this non-dual, as they call it, view of saying that there's only Brahman is real, the world is an illusion, you're also saying only the one self is real, all the individual selves are illusions. And this is the flaw. This is the misinterpretation. Because the individual selves are not illusions. How can your individual self be an illusion when it's out of the one mind? What is an illusion is the separate self. And that's why I've said, if you really want to go into a state of non-dual awareness, you have to start by looking at what pulls you out of that non-dual awareness, what keeps you out of that non-dual awareness, and that's the duality consciousness. So how did you get into the duality consciousness and come to identify yourself as a separate self? Some of these non-dual teachings, I have listened to some of these videos. I can't figure out how they would answer that question. Because they say one thing here and another thing here, and they are not necessarily compatible, and they don't really address the question. They talk about, oh, we have to reawaken to the reality, to the awareness that we are infinite awareness, or infinite awareness in us has to reawaken. But they don't explain why do we need to reawaken? Because we have forgotten, but how did we forget? And they make it seem like, oh, this was just something that happened. It just happened to us. And what I'm saying is, first of all, this is a completely disempowering view. What are you going to do about this? Oh yeah, you can sit around, you can listen to all these non-dual teachings, and you can hope that one day it's going to click, and now infinite awareness is in you is going to reawaken. But there's nothing that you can do about it. And what they would say to this reasoning is, yeah, there's nothing you can do because you don't exist, you are not real, the separate self is not real. And that's why I'm saying, for me, the only thing that makes sense here is we have to differentiate between the separate self, which isn't real, and the individual self, which is real. So, what can reawaken? What can awaken? Yeah, the separate self cannot awaken. I agree with that. But the individual self that is an extension of the one mind, that self can reawaken. And that's what the spiritual path is about. So how do you reawaken? You start to examine your current sense of self. Why am I in the sense of self I have right now? Why do I have the sense of self? Why do I have the worldview I have right now? And when you start looking at this honestly, you get to the point where you realize a very, very simple fact. I made choices. Nobody forced me. Infinite awareness or the Creator or Brahman didn't force me to go into the sense of self I have right now. I made choices. Many of those choices were made in past lives. I don't have a conscious awareness of these choices right now. And you don't necessarily have to come to re-remember your past lives and the actual situation where you made that choice. But you do have to come to an awareness of, oh, I see the choice, I see the illusion it was based on. And that's why, for me, the most liberating teaching about this is the teaching that the Ascended Masters have been given for several years now, that we have all of these subconscious selves. Instead of just one big amorphous ego, we have all of these subconscious selves. And instead of this, I remember for many years I heard about ego, I read about ego, but it always seemed overwhelming because it was like this big, huge entity with all of these different, like an octopus with all these tentacles. And it seemed impossible to get to it. But the liberating thing about these concepts of the individual selves is you can look at one self at a time. That's doable. That's manageable. You see that self, and what you actually come to see is, I'm not that self. I'm not the self. I've talked about the core of our being is the conscious you, the conscious self. And this conscious self is really a non-dual self. It's neutral. It doesn't have any opinions, certainly not dualistic opinions. So the mortal self, the conscious self isn't the mortal selves. You have not become these selves. And that's why you can separate yourself from a self, come to look at it, see how it limits you, see that it's based on an illusion. And once you see an illusion, you're free of it. Because the only way you can see an illusion is if you also see the higher understanding that's beyond the illusion, and then naturally you choose the higher understanding when you see that the illusion limits you. So, but the thing is, you have not become the self, but you did create the self. And the empowering thing about that is, what you have created, you can uncreate. But if you don't realize and accept that you have created it, you are powerless. You cannot uncreate it. So, here's what I've been saying about the duality consciousness. I've said, we start out seeing ourselves as connected beings. But as a result of free will, as a result of giving us free will, we have to be able to make the choice to go into a sense of self, where we don't see ourselves as connected beings, we see ourselves as separate beings. And this is, on a planet like Earth, perfectly allowed by the law of free will. We have a right to do this. The thing is, and this is what very, very few teachings, whether it's non-duality or anything else, will tell you. The thing is, there are certain mechanics involved with going into duality. Because you can only go into duality by using the duality consciousness, which always has the two polarities, the two extremes. And just take note of this. If you haven't grasped this from some of the other videos I've said, none of the two dualistic polarities are real. You can define them in all kinds of ways. You can define a dualistic polarity between this is real, this is unreal. But even what the dualistic mind defines as real is not real when you see it from outside the dualistic mind. What you do in the dualistic mind, you step into a perception filter. It's like putting on yellow glasses and the sky looks green. You are thinking the sky is green, that's what I'm seeing. But the sky hasn't been changed. Reality hasn't been changed because you stepped into duality. So you may define something as real when you step into duality, but it isn't real. You can't see what's real. But the conscious you can step outside of these dualistic selves. You can have what you call a mystical experience, an intuitive experience, a non-dual experience. And that's real. Then you can make contact with something that's real, and that becomes your frame of reference. So, back to free will. The only way to get into duality is to make a choice. Now, it may be that you weren't fully aware of what that choice entails. You know, most people didn't deliberately and consciously choose to step into duality. We just experimented with what we can do with our free will. It's kind of like you can compare the earth to a theater. And so you go into this room behind the stage where there are all of these costumes. And you're looking around, you're saying, oh, that costume looks interesting, I want to try that out. And that's how most of us started out we start out, as I said, a very localized sense of self. How do we expand our sense of self? By saying, oh, let me try that role. And there's nothing wrong with this. But what's the purpose of experimenting, of trying on a certain role? It's not to achieve a certain result on earth. It's to transcend your sense of self, because playing this role helps you define who you are, what kind of a being you want to be. So you have this room, there are all of these costumes you can put on, and one of them is the villain or the selfish person. And you're saying, okay, well, let me try that out. Let me see what that's like. And that's perfectly allowed. The problem is, when we step into duality, we can very gradually, and this doesn't happen in one momentous decision, it happens very gradually, we create more and more of these selves, and there comes a point where we just forget that there's something outside of duality. We don't experience it, unless, as I said, the conscious you steps outside of the dualistic selves. Then we can experience it. But the question is, even if we have these non-dual experiences, are we willing to use it as a frame of reference for questioning everything we see in duality? How do we become free of duality? By questioning everything in the dualistic mind, the dualistic perception filter, and realizing that none of it is real. And this is where we get trapped. This is the real big challenge. Look at it this way. The universe can be conceived as a mirror. So we are, as I said, designed to be co-creators. And how do we co-create? Well, we have the 4 levels of the mind. So we start at the identity level. We formulate a mental image of what kind of being we are, what kind of world we are living in, how we interact with that world. Then we bring that down into our mental minds, where we make it much more detailed, concrete, what kind of circumstance we want to live in. And then we bring it into the emotional mind, where we give it the energy, the direction, and then we project it out through the physical mind and the body. So in a sense, we can say being a co-creator means you are constantly using your mind to formulate these mental images. You project them out into the cosmic mirror. And the cosmic mirror reflects back to you what you are projecting out. And you're always doing this. You can't run away from this. Okay? Whether you believe you have no self or not, you cannot run away from this. You are a co-creator. I just watched a video with a known teacher of non-duality who said, when I look into myself, I don't find a separate self. Well, fine. But who is the I that don't find a separate self when it looks into itself? And that I is the individual self. And I'm not saying you can't come to a point where you don't have any separate self anymore, as I define a separate self, which is based on duality. But you still have an individual self, and you are still using that individual self to project into the world. Okay, so this is what you do even when you are a connected being. But what happens when you step into separation and duality? Well, when you are a connected being, you know that what comes back to you from the cosmic mirror is, at least to a large degree, influenced by what you projected out. So when you are a connected being, you are saying, you know, I didn't like what I got back from the mirror. So how can I change it? Well, the only way to change it is to change what I projected out. That's when you're a connected being and when you really understand how the universe works. You are saying, okay, I actually didn't like playing that part I'm playing. I want to play a different part because I want to change what I'm projecting out. When you go into duality, you forget this. You forget that you are projecting out. And therefore you think that whatever comes back to you from the cosmic mirror is the result of circumstances beyond your control. Here's how this plays out. When you go into duality, you're using the duality consciousness to create these polarities that have a value judgment. So there's something that's good and bad. There's something that's right and wrong. There's something that should happen to you as a separate being and something that shouldn't happen to you. So here you are still projecting out, but you're not consciously aware that you're projecting out. But you have in your mind this value judgment. This should not happen to me. And this should happen to me. So what you inevitably experience in a duality consciousness is the things that you think should not happen, they actually do happen to you. And the things that you think should happen to you, they don't happen to you. So what does that mean? That means that you now have an explanation problem. Why do you have an explanation problem? Because when you go into duality, you come to think, as I've said before, that your worldview is ultimate in some way. When you're a connected being, you realize you don't have the ultimate worldview. You just have a localized sense of self and a localized worldview. So you're projecting out with that worldview. When something comes back to you that isn't what you expected or isn't what you want, you're saying, okay, I got to project something else out. But when you go into duality, you create a worldview that you think is absolute, that should not be questioned. And according to that worldview, that absolute worldview, the way the world works, these things should not happen to me and these things should happen to me. So when you experience that the world doesn't live up to your absolute worldview, you have an explanation problem. What does that mean? It means you now have to try to explain why the world didn't conform to your worldview, why you didn't get back what you wanted to get back. But see, you can't explain it by saying, oh, I projected something out that gave me this back, so I can change what comes back by projecting something else out. Now you go into a state of mind where you have to explain why you didn't get this back. And that means you are now projecting that the cause is outside yourself. Other people didn't do what I wanted. The universe didn't do what I wanted. The physical realm, the mother realm, didn't do what I wanted. God didn't do what I wanted. Even though I prayed, and even though I lit candles, and even though I burned incense and prostrated myself on the floor, God didn't do what I wanted him to do. So now you have to come up with these explanations for this. And in the duality consciousness, there's an almost infinite variety of how you can create these explanations. But the thing is, they become more and more complicated, more and more complex, more and more convoluted. Because they are trying to explain the impossible. They are trying to explain how you can change your outer situation without changing yourself. And that's, of course, a total denial of the basic mechanics of creation, of being a co-creator. You change your outer situation by changing yourself, by changing what you're projecting out. But in the duality consciousness, you are denying this, so I have to try and find explanations. You want to see a practical example of this? Look at Vladimir Putin. Just look at how, when he started the invasion of Ukraine, he had a certain explanation. Ukraine didn't really have a right to exist as a separate nation. It was part of Russia, and he had to free the Ukrainians from the neo-Nazis. Now the thing has changed. Now it's NATO forced him to do this to defend Russia. And this can go on and on and on and on. But you notice the thing. Putin claims to be a powerful man, and he wants to be seen as the most important man in Russian history. But how do you become a powerful man? By doing things, not by being forced to do things by external circumstances. So he's continually digging a deeper and deeper hole for himself, where he has to explain that the invasion didn't go the way he expected it to go, but it wasn't his fault. It was because of these other things. But as he's doing this, he's of course contradicting the image he wants to portray, that he's in control. So I'm just, not to go into world politics here, I'm just saying this is what the duality consciousness does. So what has all this got to do with free will? Well, the question, as I said in my other video about free will, is how free is our will? And what I'm pointing out is that when we step into duality, the duality consciousness, we really severely limit our free will. Because now we become reactionary beings. As I said, we are still, without being aware of this, projecting certain images into the cosmic mirror. And the cosmic mirror is actually reflecting back what we are projecting out with the totality of our minds, most of which is subconscious. So we have a tip of the iceberg, which is the conscious mind, and there you have an expectation. This should happen to me, this should not happen to me. But then you have the 90% of the iceberg that's in the subconscious mind, which is also projecting out. And what is coming back to you as physical circumstances is a result of what you projected out subconsciously. You just don't realize that in the conscious mind. And that's why you go into this reactionary state of mind, where you think what comes back to you is not a result of what you projected out, it's external circumstances. So now you are trying to react to this, and your state of mind becomes entirely reactionary. So in order to defend this absolute worldview that you have, and in order to avoid questioning it, you have to come up with these more and more convoluted explanations, layers of explanations. And so this is a reactionary state of mind. You could say, you really don't, I really don't want to say you don't have free will, but your will is not very free, because the vast majority of your choices are determined by these subconscious selves. So in other words, it's not really a conscious choice you're making. And that's why you could say that the people who deny that we have free will, for example, scientific materialists, they have a point. If you look at most people on Earth, the vast majority of their choices are not conscious choices. Where materialists go wrong is that they only want to attribute this to the physical brain. They think it's the brain that makes choices. They don't recognize that we have a subconscious mind that is not the brain, the emotional, mental, and identity levels. And that's why they'll never really be able to explain what's going on in the human psyche. If you have a subconscious self that makes you think that if somebody else doesn't do what you want, then you're entitled to become angry. Then you're not making a choice to become angry. It's just a reaction. However, the reason why I don't want to say that we don't have any freedom of will, even in the duality consciousness, is the core of your identity, even when you go into duality, is still a conscious you. The conscious you is a non-dual being. It's a neutral being. When the conscious you steps into a separate self, it's like I said, putting on the yellow glasses, and now everything you see is colored by that separate self. But the conscious you can never lose the ability to step outside of the separate selves and have a mystical, intuitive, non-dual experience. And the conscious you cannot lose the ability to say, wait a minute, there was something I experienced that seemed more real than what's going on in my own mind. Is it possible there's something outside my own mind? Is it possible there's a higher state of awareness, a higher way of looking at life? You can never lose that ability. And this is another thing that some of these non-dual teachers really, I haven't found where they explain this. You can say non-dual awareness manifested itself as us and forgot that it's non-dual awareness. But how do people then ever wake up? You wake up because you can never lose the ability to step outside of your current sense of self. But, and I admit that many people have had these mystical experiences spontaneously. But were they really completely beyond their control? I mean, I look at myself. When I was a child, even a young child, I had many non-dual experiences. I didn't know what they were. I couldn't explain them, but I had many non-dual experiences. So you can say, okay, when I was 5 years old and had a powerful non-dual experience while I was taking a walk with my mother, that happened spontaneously. I didn't do anything to bring that about. Well, no, I didn't in this lifetime. But what if for several past lifetimes I have been consciously pursuing a spiritual path, seeking to learn about the spiritual realm and practicing various spiritual practices to raise my consciousness? How did I, when you go back, how did I come to the point where I decided to pursue a spiritual path, to try to change my state of consciousness beyond what most people have? Well, I made a decision. How else could it come about? Right? So what I've said, when you are in the duality consciousness, most of your choices are not really choices. You're not really making conscious decisions. But you can never lose the ability to make conscious decisions. So at some point in a past life, I came to a point where I had a non-dual experience. I realized, I consciously processed that experience, and I realized and decided there must be some reality outside my own mind. And I want to know what that reality is. I want to experience more of this. And this put me on a path. And if you're a spiritual seeker, you did the same thing. You probably don't remember it. I don't remember it. But nevertheless, there came a point where the conscious you made the choice to start inquiring. Who am I? What kind of being am I? What's reality like? That was a choice. How have you gotten to your present level of awareness? By making other choices. I found the spiritual path when I was 18, but I was seeking all of my life. And I made many, many choices, even as a child, to think about certain things, inquire about certain things. And when I found the spiritual path, I made a very clear decision. This is the most important thing in my life. I'm going to pursue this with everything I have. As I said, I had this period where for 3 or 4 years I was really confused because of these Vedic teachings. But then I found the Ascended Master teachings, and ever since then I've been on this very conscious path of seeking to transcend my state of consciousness, overcome my illusions. And this has required millions of choices. I mean, literally millions of choices. And I am very well aware that I made those choices. Now, it was not my separate self or my separate selves that made those choices. It was the conscious you that made those choices. But I made those choices. And my progress on the path is a result of choices I have made. Because I have will. Now, perfectly true that when you are in a duality consciousness, your will is not very free. But you can, as I said, step outside, and at least for a brief moment, you can make a more free choice. That isn't a reactionary choice. You can make a more free choice. That helps you question some of these illusions you have, the dualistic illusions. And as you question one illusion, you have a broader perspective. You see something you didn't see before. Then you can use that as a foundation for making the next choice. It isn't a completely free choice, but it's more free than in the duality consciousness. And gradually your choices become more and more free because you have a broader and broader sense of self, a broader awareness. I think, well, I don't know, but I think most people would probably agree. The more we know, the more broader of a perspective we have, the more free our choices will be. If you are walking blindfolded and you are walking towards an abyss, you can say, well, I am making a free choice to take the next step forward. For every step I take, I'm making a choice to take that step. But if you don't know that in 10 steps you're going to fall off the edge and end up at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, is that really a free choice you're making? So if you take off the blindfold and you see where you're going, obviously your choices are more free than when you couldn't see where you're going. So, you know, it's this again. As I've said, when you go into the duality consciousness, you elevate something to an absolute status and you don't question it. And then you have to explain what's happening in the world without questioning that holy cow. And in order to explain it, why the world doesn't live up to your absolute worldview, your explanations become more and more convoluted. And as I said, there are some beings who have gone into this state of mind where they think that only Brahman is real, the world is an illusion. Only undifferentiated oneness is real. Any kind of differentiation is duality and it's an illusion. And that's why they have come to this point where they have to explain that there's only infinite awareness or the separate self, nothing in between. But it's just not the case. And it's an enormously disempowering view, because all you can do is wait around and hope that infinite awareness is going to awaken you and set you free from your suffering. What I'm saying is, when you accept it, you have will. And that your present suffering, your present state of mind, is a result of choices you made in the past. And they were limited choices. Many of them were based on the duality consciousness. Many of them were based on just having a localized sense of self. When you accept this, then you are empowered. Then you can say, okay, but I don't have to be bound by a past choice forever, because I can change my choices. I can choose to look at the illusion that caused me to make a previous choice. And when I see that illusion, I'm free from the choice, at least in my mind. I'm free from how did that choice, that illusion, affect my mind. Maybe some physical consequences that are more difficult to overcome, but you are free in your mind from that illusion. And it is your state of mind that causes your present experience of life, whether it's suffering or not. So the more you make the choice to look at these separate selves and transcend the separate selves, let them die, the more free you become in your mind, and the more free your choices will be. As I said, when you realize you have a higher self, and that's who you really are because you're an extension of that higher self, you don't become a marionette. You're still making choices. As long as you're an embodiment, the conscious you is still making choices. I am making a choice. Every day I acknowledge that I'm making a choice. Many of my choices are not made through the filter of a separate self. Some still are. But many times when I see the consequences of a choice, I can say, okay, let me just look at the separate self that caused me to make that choice. Or let me look at the separate self that caused me to react when I got that result back from the cosmic mirror. And that leads to greater and greater freedom. Whereas denying that we have that ability, it just keeps you trapped in this state of having to explain why the world doesn't live up to your expectations, and going into these more and more convoluted. I see people out there who are basically trying to explain this. Why doesn't the world conform to my worldview? And they're so intellectual, they're so convoluted, they keep going around in circles, they're just trapped. They're confused. They know there's something there that they're not seeing, but they can't see it because there's something they're not willing to question. And I've experienced in my life that anytime you're held back from making progress, it's because there's something in your worldview, in your mind, that you haven't been willing to question. And I'm not saying, again, that you should question everything all at once. That's why I've talked about a gradual path, a balanced path where you don't lose your bearings, you don't lose your sense of identity. But you don't have to do anything, but it certainly helps you greatly if you can adopt this conscious attitude that I am willing to question whatever limits me. Whatever comes up, whatever I see, I'm willing to question it. Because if there's something here that I can't explain, it must be because there's something in my worldview that I haven't questioned. And it's the same thing with free will. How free is your will? You have a will. The very fact that you exist as an individual being means you have a will, because you are created to be a co-creator. And how do you co-create? By making choices. You're making choices as to what mental images you're formulating in your mind, what you are projecting out, how you're reacting to what comes back, how you're reacting to the physical circumstances you are in on this very dense planet called Earth, where you really can't expect that the world is going to conform to your expectations. Even if you are making non-dual choices, you can't expect that the world is going to conform, because so many people on Earth are in a lower state of consciousness. You see some of these people out there who are talking about manifestation, manifesting, and they think that if I am just projecting out an entirely positive image, the universe must respond and give me back what I'm projecting out. But this is part of realizing what kind of planet you are on. You can purify your state of awareness as much as you can, but you still can't expect that when you project something out, the universe is going to give you back exactly what you're projecting out, because there's so many other people on the planet who are in a dualistic state of consciousness, and this is what the Buddha called the interdependent originations. So what I'm saying is that even when you reach a non-dual state of awareness, the higher levels of awareness, you still can't expect that you can manifest the exact physical circumstances that you want. What you do when you reach the higher levels of awareness is you can control your reactions to the physical circumstances you have. And that is ultimately free will. It's not really free will that you can get whatever circumstances you want on a planet like Earth. But the ultimate expression of free will is that you are free to choose your reactions to any circumstance you encounter on Earth. That's ultimately free will. Free will ultimately is your mind. What happens in your mind, what you do with your mind. But you are living on a physical planet with 8 billion other people who also have free will. And most of them have exercised or exercising it through the duality consciousness. And you cannot expect that even if you reach a higher level of consciousness, that they're going to conform. So therefore, what is the ultimate free will that you can have on a planet like Earth? It is that you have total freedom to control or choose what goes on in your mind, how you react to conditions on Earth. Because if you try to control other people, control your circumstances, you end up controlling other people, and that's what what I've called the fallen beings have been doing for a very, very long time. And they only can attempt to do this through the duality consciousness, and that's not enlightenment. So again, I know this can't address all the questions around these topics, but I hope it's at least been helpful to some people, because I can tell you that for me, I've talked about this situation where after I took this meditation course, I was in limbo for 3 or 4 years. And part of that limbo was that I actually doubted whether I have free will. And if I realized that if I didn't have free will, well, nothing really mattered. I mean, what could I do? If I didn't, what difference did it make? Why should I meditate? Why should I strive to be a good person if it didn't make any difference, if I didn't have any free will? So it was tremendously liberating for me to realize. But I do have the ability to choose whether I will reinforce the sense of self I have right now, or whether I will transcend that self and strive to reach higher levels of consciousness. And that's the choice I'm always making. To descend into separation or to ascend into spiritual freedom. So that's really the basic choice we have. It's not always a completely free choice, because we're in a limited state of consciousness. And when we first find the spiritual path, we have a limited view. And as I've said, we take our world, we project it onto the spiritual path. But if we keep making this choice to question an illusion, to ascend to the next level, we will gradually become more and more free, until one day you're going to look back and say, I can't believe I've changed so much. I am so much more free than I was 10, 20, or 47 years ago. So I certainly hope that this can help you put yourself on that path, because my experience of walking that path has been tremendously rewarding. It's been enormously rewarding. Any kind of difficulty I've gone through, it's all been worth it. It's just wonderful to become more and more free, and to know that you can continue to walk that path towards greater and greater spiritual freedom. That is free will.